Hello and welcome everyone to webinar 14 in the with Ukrainian Jungian series. For today's slideshow, appreciation goes to Anna Mitsuk and Cheryl Towers for the music, to Sally Alexander and Claire Mouchot for the images, and for the creation of the show itself to Joseph Cox, who we also recognize together with Sanctus Media for technical assistance. Let me remind you to please select the channel that best suits you among the choices for language. This can be done through the globe icon at the bottom right side of your screen, or the three dots with more, which when clicked upon will show you the choices. One of our presenters, Anna Mitsuk, will be speaking in Ukrainian, so please take note. Now, let me welcome everyone to webinar 14 of this series. This one's entitled Presence, Manifestation, and Proclamations of the Symbol in War. My name is Joe Cambray, and I'm from the advisory board of WUJ. I previously hosted webinar 13, and I'm continuing to do so today because our dear Catherine Cox needs to step back from this role at the present time due to continuing needs to attend to the serious medical crisis in her family. We ask you to hold her and her family in your hearts and minds with love during this time of trial and tribulation for them. She was very involved in the organization of this webinar, and she will certainly be watching the recording with great interest. Because we have two full, complex, and moving presentations today, there will not be a live Q&A portion. However, please write any questions or comments you may have in an email to us at wuj@citypsychotherapy.org, and we will make sure they are passed on to the speakers. Claire will put the email address now in the chat so that you can copy that if you have that. To give maximum time to the presenters, I will keep my remarks brief. As we pass into the third spring since this terrible invasion from Russia, the world faces increasing numbers of crises and dangers. Worries about erasure of peoples and cultures is unfortunately a growing and deep concern. The ongoing blatant aggression by Russia in Ukraine is creating an enormous challenge for the democracies of the world. We need our leaders to recognize the dangers to us all and to more fully support the Ukrainian effort to resist and counter the violent hostilities. The indefatigable Ukrainian spirit has been an inspiration to the world, not only in the military resistance to the brutal invasion, but also in their embracing of values. This week, the world was informed how the Kharkiv Opera and Ballet is reopening underground for performances, despite the risks that they must endure. Kharkiv is a city which is home to one of today's speakers on Mitsuk. The importance of culture to our psychic lives is indispensable. Let us all salute this and all the heroic efforts the Ukrainians are making to sustain the life of the soul. It's the war. Issues of resources and support for Ukraine are topics of vital concern for the democracies of the international community. For us in the US, hearing President Biden's State of the Union remarks with his attention to the need for continued support of Ukraine was heartening. However, ill-advised remarks, such as the comment by the Pope on Sunday, encouraging Ukrainians to, in quote, raise the white flag, sadly undermine unity and create confusion, especially coming from a spiritual leader. Psychologically, it is indeed a dark time where holding the opposite's intention is becoming increasingly difficult, at times impossible, and the world fragments into seemingly unbridgeable polarizations. Today's speakers will take us on some deeply meaningful personal journeys into this subject. Jungian analyst Jörg Hogenson, who also has a background in war planning, is able to combine fields, creating insights and perspectives in novel and informative ways. Anna Mitsuk, a Jungian analyst currently living in Southeast England and traveling back to Kharkiv regularly, will offer music and images for her city, especially during the last 2 years. To introduce them more fully, I would like to tell you a bit about our chair today. A friend and colleague, Dr. Jörg Rasche, physician, Jungian analyst for children and adults, trained at the C.G. Jung Institute in Berlin and in Zurich. And he's also trained in sandplay with Dora Kolf. He's also a trained musician from Berlin, and he teaches at the Jung Institutes in Berlin and Zurich and in numerous countries. For many years, he was the president of DGAP, the German Association for Analytical Psychology, and I had the privilege of getting to know Jörg during our years together on the IAP Executive Committee. Initially, he had been the DGAP's representative to the Executive Committee and went on to become a vice president of the organization when I was president-elect. Over the years, it's been a joy to work with him, to listen to his presentations, to follow his remarkable career, and to listen to his music, as at the Art and Psyche conferences. A compassionate humanitarian, he has worked diligently, even tirelessly, at communal reconciliation. He has been a key part of the IAP efforts throughout Eastern Europe and beyond. For his engagement in psychotherapy in Poland and people's reconciliation, he was honored in 2012 with the Golden Cross of Merit by the President of Poland. As a scholar analyst, Jörg has published on psychoanalysis, sandplay, music and psyche, and the history of Jungian analysis. In 2016, he co-edited with Tom Singer Europe's Many Souls, Exploring Cultural Complexes and Identities from Spring Journals. And recent publications include Franzkus und der Salten, Menetekel, der Oxide und das Unbewusst, was die Kreises mit uns macht. Und Spinozas Freund und die Substanz der Freiheit. And in preparation, Cultural Complexes in Europe's Many Souls, Volume 2, Brexit and War in Ukraine, from Routledge, together with Tom Singer. So I turn it over to Jörg. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. This was too much about me. I feel very honored to chair this important meeting. The war in Ukraine is in my mind every day. I've been for several years in Kiev, and I love these people and this courageous city. I feel with you. I'm deeply disappointed by the collective ignorance and anesthesia in Russia regarding Putin's criminal war. But I also see the suffering of many Russians who can't openly speak for their country. This is a big dilemma and disaster for Europe. I hope that the winter will end soon. it is time to try to understand what is really going on in the collective unconscious in these critical times and to stay together. The brutal aggression of Putin's army against Ukraine has deeply changed the political and psychological situation in Europe. Overnight, the supposed but vulnerable security of daily life gave way to fears and even anxieties of extinction, also in Germany. In addition to the ecological crisis and threat, now the suffering and danger of an extended war leads to both collective depression and/or aggressive defense mechanisms. In Germany, for example, after 1945, the traditional pacifism is going to be pushed away by long-forgotten militarist and racist mentality. So also traditional and Jungian positions about integrating the shadow are in danger. Obviously, the open war requires another positioning when the soldier matrix becomes the prevalent archetypal pattern in a society. I am personally an ardent pacifist, and the militarist attitude forced upon us by Putin makes me angry. I refuse to accept the alternative of either being caught in the pro-war soldier matrix or to be regarded as a traitor of my people. Anyhow, maybe it's time for a kind of an ethical cash audit, moralischer Kassensturz, about the ethical and moral values in Europe and of some principal values of Jungian psychology. In a war, you must win. Does this include the need to kill the enemy? How then can the shadow be integrated, the individual and the collective shadow? C.G. Jung struggled with his personal and the collective shadow during fascism, Stalinism, and the Holocaust. The criticism of Jung was that he didn't take clearer positions. What remains if we really make a moral cash audit, Kassensturz, of our Jungian principles? I think that the feeling function is essential in critical situations like this. Not to look away, not to shut the eyes of our heart, to accept the sadness and mourning about all the victims, be it in Bucha, Mariupol, Kharkiv, and on the other side, and the anger against the traitors of human values. So this I wanted to say for an introduction, and now we will have a minute of silence, I guess, with little light, and then I can introduce our two speakers. So thank you. Thank you. Now I want to introduce very shortly our speakers. The first will be Jörg Hogenson. Jörg is a senior training at the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago and a member of the Chicago Society of Jungian Analysts. He holds a PhD in philosophy from Yale University and a Master of Art, and he has served as vice president of the EAP and is on the editorial board for the Journal for Analytical Psychology. He is author of numerous books, and he is, I can say, a good friend, and I'm very glad and proud that he will be with us now. Our second speaker will be from Ukraine, Anna Mitsuk. Anna is a master of clinical psychology. She is Jungian analyst, supervisor, trainer of analysts in the frame of EAP, and supervisor. She graduated from the Minsk State Institute for Foreign Languages, graduated from the Moscow Institute of Psychoanalysis. And she studied for 6 years and received a certificate in the Melanie Klein Trust. And in Ukraine, she did a lot of work with supervising therapists working with adult and children in the occupied territories of displaced people, of traumatized people. In 2022, she had to leave Ukraine and went to London, where she is now living, and will give us a presentation today about her experience. So thank you for listening. And now, George, it's your turn now.
Добрий вечір,
Oh,
дорогі
sorry,
колеги
Anya
та
starts.
всі учасники вебінару. Свою
Good
презентацію
evening, dear
я хочу
colleagues and all
почати з
participants
мелодії
of the
видатного
webinar. I would
українського
like to start my
композитора
presentation with the
Мирослава
melody by the
Скорика
outstanding
в
Ukrainian
виконанні
composer
Ігоря
Miroslav
Чернявського,
Skorik, performed
солиста
by Igor
Харківської
Chernявsky,
обласної
soloist
філармонії.
of Kharkiv
На
Regional
тлі цієї
Philharmonic.
чарівної музики
Against
ви
the backdrop of
побачите
this enchanting music, you will see my beautiful,
але незламне і
long-suffering,
непереможне
but
місто
unbreakable,
Харків.
invincible hero
Ми,
city of Kharkiv.
харків'яни, любимо
We,
наше
the
місто
people of
і
Kharkiv, we
Україну.
love our
Та
city and
вистоїмо і
Ukraine.
переможемо.
We will stand and we will prevail.
Лютий був такий, як завжди.
February was, as usual, cold winter month. In our cozy house, we spent our days. However, there was alarm in the air. A number of days, this anxiety grew stronger and stronger. The embassies of a number of countries left Kyiv, and Russian troops were stationed in large numbers near the borders of the country. The word war and Russia's attack were already getting closer and closer to us. But deep down, something seemed to calm me down and said, no, it was not possible. Our countries were intertwined with family ties, and our industries or economies were also very much interconnected. This will never happen, I thought in my head. Our relatives lived in Moscow, in Kazan, in Belgorod, in many cities of Belarus. But then February 24 came and life turned upside down. We learned what rocket and bomb explosions are, what happens in a person's soul when the alarm sounds 30 times a day. First, a warning alarm, then the disarming signal alarm, and they're absolutely the same and horrible. In the early days, when the sirens were sounding, we would run to the bomb shelter and stay there until the alarm went off. There was fear that started somewhere in the heart and then permeated the whole body. And normal life suddenly came to an end. In the early days, all small shops, all small businesses were closed, all those businesses that provided services to people. Public transport stopped to operate, and taxes basically didn't work either. And a curfew was imposed, and during curfew, it was not allowed to be outside. There were interruptions in electricity and water supply. In the evening, it was forbidden to turn on the lights in the apartment, and the roar of the alarms was added to the sounds of planes flying over our city. And these sounds were followed by the explosions of rockets and bombs, and it was terrible. It was a complete nightmare and horror. I still hear the sound of flying planes and helicopter, and they evoke terrible memories and a lot of anxiety. A lot of anxiety for the people close to me and for our country, Ukraine. A couple of days after the war outbroke, a rocket flew over our house a few meters away from our house, and it exploded on Freedom Square, and it damaged the building of the Kharkiv Regional Administration and partially destroyed it. Kharkiv residents were injured and killed. A few months later, we found out that the son of our close friends was killed there. A few days later, another tragedy happened, where our relatives leaving the Bucha city by car, the car and the family was shot by the occupiers. Today, I continue to work with the victims from Bucha to this day. All districts of Kharkiv were constantly subjected to bombardment and artillery shelling. Especially Saltivsky Massiv and Zhukhovsky village suffered, and the shelling did not stop almost day or night. People had to leave everything and had to flee the city. Basically, all cities of Ukraine were under shelling, and it felt like we were already living in hell. Kharkiv residents started to leave their hometowns by trains, by their cars. They fled for more distant places in Ukraine. But we cannot name it just leaving, because imagine thousands of people standing at the railway stations, storming the trains, and all is happening to the sounds of explosions. And it went on for several months. The city was very uneasy, very anxious, and there was a lack of food and even a lack of bread. Brave volunteers prepared hot meals and delivered them to different parts of the city, risking their lives. The citizens, people lined up in long lines, and they were very grateful for this crucial help and assistance. I want to go back to the beginning of the war, how the city and the regional authorities reacted to everything. In the very first hours and days of the aggression, the mayor of Kharkiv, Ihor Terechov, addressed the city and people, and he asked people not to leave their homes. He informed them that kindergartens and schools were closed and asked people to remain calm. A bit later, he also said that all public transport ceased to operate, and he asked people to go down to the metro stations and it would be safer there. Also, the SBU published an appeal to the residents of Kharkiv and the region. And here are some examples from these appeals. Martial law has been introduced in the country. This is a necessary step for the security of the state and for our victory. It is an essential step. We would like to address the residents of Kharkiv region and to tell you to stay calm. The situation in which our homeland is facing right now requires our unity, calmness, and determination from all of us. A difficult and tragic day at the beginning of the war ended with an address of President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. He said that he called on all EU leaders to stand together, shoulder to shoulder, with Ukraine. After all, the fate of the whole Europe is being decided in Ukraine. And this is when I realized that a war had started and that it will last for a long time. In Kharkiv, utility services started posting leaflets on how to act in the event of a threat of hostilities, what to do if you fall under rubble or explosions. Kharkiv is a border city that, with the outbreak of the full-scale war, became one of the first targets of the Russian invaders. However, they managed to enter only one district of our city, Saltivka. It was there that the battle over the Ukrainian flag started and continued, because this district managed to withstand the enemy back in 2014. Russian aircraft intensely attacked Kharkiv. Russian troops deliberately destroyed civilian infrastructure with artillery, with multiple launch rocket systems and Kalibr missiles, resulting in numerous civilian casualties. The constant shelling subsided slightly only at the end of September 2022, when the armed forces of Ukraine pushed the invaders out of Kharkiv. All Kharkiv residents lived in a constant state of pathological stress and tried to survive from day to day. In previous webinars, we have all heard wonderful stories from my Ukrainian colleagues about Ukraine, its rich history, its traditions, and its culture. My husband and my daughter are good singers, and they know a lot of folk songs. And my grandparents, who were Polish, they loved and sang songs in Ukrainian, and they knew many old folk songs. And here a quote from Jung came to my mind, and it says, "Anyone who wants to learn about the human psyche learns almost nothing from experimental research or from psychology. That person would be better off giving up the exact sciences, taking off the mantle of a scientist, saying goodbye to their office, and traveling the world with a human heart. There, in prisons, in insane asylums and hospitals, in dingy suburban pubs, in brothels, and in gambling halls, in churches, through love and hate, through the experience of passion in all its forms in their own body, they will reap a richer store of knowledge than a foot-thick textbook can give them. And they will know how to treat the sick by truly knowing the human soul. I found the work with the human psyche underground, literally underground. Analytical work in different ways is work in the field. For a long time, I worked in the subway of Kharkiv, not only in the dungeon, the realm of unconscious, but in a real dungeon, the subway. All the metro lines were closed, and people lived in tents on the metro platforms and in carriages at the stations. The conditions there were terrible. They were unsanitary and uncomfortable. But they were safe in those difficult days of the war. I worked with clients in a train carriage with a curtained off viewing area, and I used this carriage as a temporary consulting room. People there were respectfully waiting for their turn, and many of those people had traumas related to the loss of their homes, the loss of their jobs, or their loved ones. These traumas were a serious problem for most of them. So I've been doing this for a very long time. Among the people who lived in the subway, there was a 75-year-old Japanese man who had moved to Kharkiv before the war had begun. His name was Fuminori Tsuchiko. Every day, despite the shelling, he ran to the shops to buy food and to distribute this food to the people. He also raised funds to support pensioners, and he said that he would live in Kharkiv and that he liked the city a lot, and that he was here for a long time and he would keep helping Kharkiv people. One woman fled Donetsk and she was pregnant. Living on the subway platform without her family nearby, she gave birth to her son, and she asked me to be the godmother of her son. I supported her psychologically during her childbirth while she was in labor. She gave birth in those terrible conditions without the medical care that we are used to having in peacetime. A nurse risked her life to get to the hospital and get the medicine to help with that woman's labor. I continue to work with Ukrainian clients who are in Ukraine or who have moved to temporary residence around the world. For me, those people are an example of victory over despair. They are an example of survival in those difficult times. Survival and sustainability. In my life, I've faced a lot of events when I had to survive, and my resilience was formed on the basis of such extreme experiences. Once we were sailing on a small boat with my family on the Black Sea when a 6-point storm started. The waves were up to 6 meters high, and we were scared for our lives. The captain and God saved us. The captain managed to steer the boat between the waves. We sailed for more than an hour, and the captain skillfully maneuvered in the angry sea. But if the engine had died, the sea would have swallowed us. A dangerous moment between life and death. Before the war, one of the areas of my work was focusing on the study of the connection between mental processes and the body, and I paid a lot of attention to psychosomatics. I went with a team of professionals to the so-called places of power with picturesque nature, and often those places were located in rural areas. The patients were people with with serious diagnosis.
Це була особлива
It
програма,
was a special
де
program
поїхали
that
різні
combined various
нестандартні підходи
non-standard
лікування.
approaches to treatment.
На природі ми проводили різні
In the nature, we
вправи,
did
для кожного
various
пацієнта
exercises, and each
індивідуальний
patient was treated
Зокрема,
individually.
проводився аналіз
Specifically, we
продукції снів
analyzed
пацієнта,
the
а
patient's
також
dreams,
проводили
and we
індивідуальну
also
групову
had
роботу.
individual and
Стан
group work,
здоров'я багатьох пацієнтів
and many
покращився.
patients' health has improved.
Психіка і тіло
The
працюють
mind and the body,
разом.
they work together.
Теорія
The
майстерні
theory
та
of the
метод, на
workshop
який ми
and the
спираємося,
method we relied on
заснований
were
юнгіанським
developed by a
аналітиком
Jungian
із
analyst from Santa
Санта-Барбари,
Barbara, US.
Стівеном
His name
Айзенстадом.
is Steven Eisenstadt.
Теж ми збираємо первинну матерію.
So where do we call to the primary
Ніколи не
matter?
забуду
I will
ресурс,
never
який
forget this
закладає
resource
основу
that
для
lays
руху
the
людей далі.
foundation for people
На
to
різних
help them move
тканях,
on,
як ми
the
можемо
cornerstone of
сприйматися
how we
в цій
can
нестабільній
hold
реальності,
on
яка
to
в нас
hold
є.
on to this in this
Люди
unstable
знають,
reality we have. And
що
people
їм
know that they
треба йти в
should
бомбосховище
go
під час
to the
тривог,
bomb shelter
або
during
залишатися
alarms,
вдома,
or they should
де
stay at
тебе
home
має захищати
where they can
правило
be
3 сил.
protected by the
Війна
three-wall
робить наші
rule.
душі
The war makes our
сильнішими
souls
або
stronger
жорстокішими.
or tougher.
І залежно від
And
нашої
depending on our
стійкості,
resilience,
ми
we
більшою чи
react to
меншою
war
мірою
to a
реагуємо
greater or
на війну.
lesser extent.
Те ж саме
The same
відбувається і
thing
з дітьми.
happens with children.
Вони можуть
They
реагувати
react
зовсім
in completely
по-різному.
different
Багато
ways.
працюю з
I
українськими
worked with a lot of
клієнтами,
Ukrainian
у декого
clients,
є
and
діти
some of them
чи
have
онуки.
children, some of them
Їхні
have
реакції,
grandchildren,
як
and their reactions,
дитячі,
both
так
at
і
children
дорослих,
and
дуже
adults,
різні.
are all very
Я
different.
відчуваю,
And I
що я
feel
свідок.
that I'm a witness.
Я збираю
I'm
інформацію,
collecting
я
information.
обробляю
I
цю
process this
інформацію,
information.
а також
And I
я
also
бачу
see
свої
my
і
purpose,
здібності.
and I know my
Що я
abilities.
можу
I know
зробити?
what I can do.
Бути свідком і
I
мати
can be witness,
можливість
and I am
допомогти.
able to help.
Харків – перша столиця
Kharkiv was the
України.
first
Столиця
capital of Ukraine.
1,5
It has the
мільйона,
population of
1,5
about
мільйона жителів.
1.6 million. This was the population prior to the war. It was a big, comfortable, beautiful city, one of the best cities in Ukraine. We have a lot of beautiful, pretty places that are worth seeing, that are worth visiting. A lot of tourists came to visit and see the city. They appreciated the authenticity of the city and this national part that you find in its culture, in its architecture, in its cuisine, and in its people. We wanted to be independent. We wanted to live independently. And now we see destruction. But most importantly, the most important potential that we have is our people. We've got rich mineral resources. We've got unique fertile land. 4 of our nephews are currently on the front line. It's very difficult to know that your relatives are there on the front line. And hundreds of our best men and women are dying every day at the front line. It was really hard to stay in Kharkiv after the war started. It was extremely difficult. The loudspeaker that announces the air raid siren at the beginning of an attack is located right in front of my window. The explosions happened very close to us. It's very important to be the witness to this tragedy, as I have already said. Finding resources is important. Many people feel frozen in their trauma. The first year was extremely hard. We have a huge residential area in Kharkiv called Saltivsky, and over 300,000 people lived there. At the beginning of the war, it was almost empty. The windows were black, and almost all the residents had left their homes. It was extremely sad. But what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. We were able to return to the relative state of normality. Public transport is back in operation. People are working, even though at the beginning over 1 million people left and only 300,000 people remained in the city. I started talking about resources. During the war, I conducted 2 courses on trauma work for psychologists, doctors, and social workers. The Women in Jungian program, and I led reflective support groups both in person and online for different people, for different categories of people. I also found a place for Jungian psychoanalysis. My work gave me so many resources. Women and men, young and old, all of them, and the work began, and death seemed to recede. I can talk a lot about how to be a witness. Our young people, our children, our grandchildren, they need to know about the beauty of the Ukrainian soul, the strength of the spirit, and the resilience of the Ukrainian people under such difficult circumstances. There are always moments when you can see those qualities, and the war sharpens and shows the good in us, and it highlights the bad. But most of all, what I saw was the good. When people help and support, this is the energy of human warmth.
People are exhausted. 2 years have passed. All of us hoped that it would end soon, but it hasn't. We never thought that we would raise our children to die in this inhuman war. We all hoped for a better future for them. We wanted them to get a good education and bring something good into this world. And then this happened. I still cannot wrap my head around that. It may be easy to say, to talk about that, but we will need time to explore and discuss it. I'm so grateful to everyone who have organized the project. It is incredible that this project started when the war broke out to support Jungians in Ukraine. This is a professional container that has been supporting us. Colleagues from all over the world are showing interest in our work with deeply traumatized patients. It changes the system around them, and this energy comes to the forefront. Duality of darkness and light. Darkness, cruelty, and death. But there is life in this. It is humanity of others, which I also have witnessed. That's what keeps life alive. This makes me think about the image used by our esteemed analysts in their presentation, the dichotomy of darkness and light. It also resonates with me. The duality and images of light and darkness. It's something that you see everywhere. We are talking about people who have lost their loved ones. How can one accept all of that? Young people are buried every day, boys and girls. The mom who sent her child there prayed for her child every day, and then the child was brought back in a coffin. What could be more horrific than that? This is the 21st century. We have just gone through the horror of the pandemic, when people died unexpectedly, and then we get this horror, the horror of the war. Consequences of this war, of this trauma, will be enormous. A lot of psychosomatic phenomena. The metaphor is what to do to make steel stronger. There is no turning back. People are getting stronger at the front line in factories, at their workplaces. Us Jungians, we feel at home in this symbolism. It is something that can be shown via the images of something beautiful and horrible at the same time. And I can feel this duality everywhere. on both sides, on light and darkness. Some kind of alchemy is happening. It is important what we will get when the war is over. What will happen to the soul, to the psyche? What will happen to the younger generation? What will happen to Ukraine? Every citizen is asking these questions today. Thinking and perception have sharpened in times of crisis. We do not know what will happen next. We are normal people. We are fighting for our land, and we hope to overcome this, to prevail. Men and women are dying every day. We need a lot of help. And these webinars help us too. They give us psychological, moral, financial support. When a stranger gives you a flower, looks into your eyes and says you are not alone, or also maybe offers their hand and you realize that not everything is in vain. And if specialists can use our knowledge and our experience, it would mean a lot. This is now the reality of many people. It makes sense. People have seen what is happening, and they have right to speak up. The war may become an abstraction in the mind of others, but it is real, and something has to become a bridge between the abstract and sensual experience. Being a witness means taking one step beyond experience. By witnessing, one becomes a resource. Telling the story to others is very helpful at a deep level. That takes others out of their isolation of the experience. You have to know about the absurdity and horror, about the situations when people die. People die from war, but when this horror is over, there will be this unsolvable conflict, other people's ambitions, and people will have to cope with it somehow. How will this affect the future generation? We can talk about a lot of things here, about the human nature, human psyche. We are all closely connected. I am relieved when I hear questions about what will happen after the war. The war will end one day. We can think about life after the war. I believe that the war resonates everywhere, in every cell of every Ukrainian citizen. To be an active witness, not to stand behind a productive screen, doing everything one can do as far as possible to make efforts to do so. Not a hero, but a witness close to the battlefield. You never know what will happen tomorrow. The situation is very precarious, and there is now a lot of talk about the Third World War. We must try our best to prevent the war. Jung said about the war, I am far from being convinced that we are heading towards World War III. It may happen, but it may also be prevented. On the other hand, the problems that have split the world are quite real, and everything that has led us to this split may lead us to the war. Even if there is no war, the split remains. The split between the East and West, and this means a split in each of us, because we are all humans. There is some hope that people will realize that split within themselves and understand that there is no need to reproduce it in politics. But this means complete change of our spiritual and inner perceptions. We are intimidated with nuclear weapons, the red button. In 1986, I took part in liquidation of the consequences of the man-made disaster in Chernobyl. I was in the 30-kilometer zone around Chernobyl. I worked during the evacuation of school children, and I know something about the invisible enemy, radiation. I also had to undergo various treatment courses for the effects of radiation. It was very difficult life experience on the verge of death. And now, these intimidations with nuclear weapons, well, we can only imagine how horrible a war would be with use of nuclear weapons. I believe that we must do everything to prevent this. If we let this genie out of the bottle, it will be the end of the world. Our Ukrainian colleagues, analysts, and analytical psychologists, they are a reflection of the Ukrainian society. We feel hatred for the enemy. They came uninvited. They came as thieves with their nonsense about denazification. Thinking about our academic terminology, I could talk long about it, but I want to talk simply about my feelings and impressions. Recently, I saw a situation about an officer who was standing in the square wearing military uniform in the city of Lviv at an event. He was about 40 years old. Maybe he had his 10 days of leave from the front line. They performed the Ukrainian national anthem. He was standing there and tears were streaming from his face. He was crying, sobbing, trying to hide his tears. I thought then about my countertransference on those feelings. What was going on in his soul when the man heard the anthem? Maybe he realized life goes on, but he would return to the hell, to the war for the sake of victory. The war will end one day. We can think about life after this war. My colleagues and I work with trauma cases. It's not easy. I worked in military hospital with a man who lost his limbs. He was so young. When the war is over, all these people will have the opportunity to adapt, adjust to this life after the experience of being in hell. Us, mental health professionals, will need to think about helping a lot of people after the war. We need to be prepared for this, and we need to find the most effective ways to help them recover. We will need to communicate our findings to certain institutions in the mental health system at the state governmental level in order to officially bring back valuable resources. I carry this war inside me, but I have dreams. One of them is that I want to write a book. I will be able to tell this story to my grandchildren. Jung said, our mind consciousness sparkles. Everything there is full of light and seems to be in perfect order. But there is another side, which is not so shiny. And of course, something needs to be done about it. At the same time, no one likes to dig into it. However, sometimes it is unavoidable, especially if you fall into it. This phenomenon can be traced in the gigantic scale that history operates. Just look at what happened to Germans. The German nation was completely reborn, succumbing to the dark side of the human nature. We all know what horrors this resulted in. Yes, this is the dark side. Everyone has it. And it contains things that we know nothing about. One cannot avoid that. As soon as I start working with someone, their dark side always comes out. One thing or another becomes apparent. And all these things have to be somehow linked with the human consciousness. This is necessary for a particular individual to stop seeing themselves as some kind of an ideal that they would like to be, but realize who they actually are. This is where the work with each individual starts. Our worldview, based on statistical averaging, is an abstraction that has nothing to do with what happens in the real world. In this worldview, the individual is nothing more than a random phenomenon, but in reality, the individual is the only reality.
These were very moving words, and I'm very grateful to Anya that she made us a kind of witness of her experiences, and I'm very grateful for that, and I hope she will write her book and maybe also come to Germany to tell us about her perspectives and the vision of light in her life. And now we come to Jörg Hogenson, and we are very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Jörg. Let me begin by also thanking Anna for her deeply felt witness to the war in its most personal horror. She and all the others who've experienced these events require our unrelenting support and recognition of what they have endured. Our first obligation is to them. Anna's account of her experiences and those of her friends and all the others provides a window into the core issue of these presentations. The response of the Jungian community, preferably in collaboration with many other international organizations, attempting to mitigate some of the suffering that this war has brought to Ukraine. This has been a difficult presentation for reasons I hope will become evident as I proceed. I know I have driven the organizers to distraction with delays and sometimes prolonged periods of silence. To explain why, I will begin with an exchange I had with a colleague here in Chicago, Donna Marie Flanagan, on October 8th, 2022. Our Chicago Society occasionally holds salons or seminars for discussion among the analysts. And on March 8th, in other words, less than 2 weeks after the Russian invasion, Donna Marie wrote me, "Dear George, a few of the Chicago analysts have echoed my wonderment about how to respond to analysans who bring the world trauma of Ukraine into their analysis. Does your international experience give you the basis for offering a springboard for discussion? I'm rather sure it does. More to the point, would you like to do that? I'll pass on your answer." My reply was fairly long, and I will cover most of what I said in the rest of this presentation, so I've edited my email reply to its essential elements. Dear Donna Marie, good to hear from you. I hope all is well, other than that the world is coming to an end. In terms of the Ukraine situation, this kind of thing is going to be with us from here on out and will probably get worse. That raises the issue of compounding crises and people giving way to despair over the entire array of problems facing the world, Ukraine, climate change, and the pandemic. We will have to see how that plays out over time. If you want to be Jungian about all of this, you can view the war and some of the other crises as genuinely numinous events, mysterium tremendum et fascinans. I expect this war to be far more terrible than most people realize. The Civil War General William T. Sherman's famous comment is correct. War is barbarity. It cannot be refined. War is hell. Sorry for the sentiment, but I'm afraid I am more likely to upset people when the horrors of war come up, because my primary reaction is, what did you expect? Best regards, George. I went on to discuss what I already knew about the IAAP efforts to support Ukrainian analysts and some other international efforts, but this was the core of my response. On March 16th, 2022, I had the following dream. I have missed the salon. I can't get it out of my mind that the salon was my idea, and now I have missed it. This continues until I look at my calendar and see it is only March 16th, and I realize I was wrong. Then I look at the scheduling email and realize that we will be discussing the Ukraine situation. That is absolutely the one thing I do not want to do. That's the end of the dream. Of course, the salon was not my idea, but the dream made it clear that I could not avoid this discussion. However, I evidently did not want to get into the discussion of the war based on my experience in the military and international relations more generally. I did not believe that my experience would offer much in the way of handling the situation in the consulting room. It was also around this time that our colleague Stefano Carpani began his series of interviews with analysts, War as Reset, and he asked me to participate. Our discussion took place on March 28th, 2022, and I would encourage anyone who has not viewed the interviews in Stefano's series to seek them out. My discussion with Stefano does open up much of what I viewed as essential to understanding the origins of the war at that time and the larger historical setting within which it was unfolding, including the religious dimension that receives far too little attention. But we were still only a month into the conflict. However, one comment I made in the interview stands out to me. We were already seeing video of the use of the United States provided Javelin anti-tank missiles to destroy Russian tanks. And I remember...
Excuse me, George, sorry, I'll interrupt. It's a little bit too fast for the interpreters.
I will
If you
slow
can slow down a bit. Thank you.
We were already seeing video of the use of the United States provided Javelin anti-tank missiles to destroy Russian tanks. And I remarked that when one of these missiles hit a tank, those inside were not simply killed, they were incinerated almost immediately. There's more to be said about the weapons that have been developed for modern war. But as I intended to make clear in this comment, the only thing that is precise about them is the guidance to the target. Beyond that, it is all about their absolute destructiveness. To honestly think about war, modern war, you must keep that fact at the forefront of your mind. When this project began, I was invited to participate, which I readily agreed to in a way of supporting our colleagues in Ukraine. When I began thinking about my contribution, beyond the initial engagement with Ukrainian societies, where both Joe and I presented on work we had previously done, I intended to prepare some reflections on one of the most extraordinary moments in the early days of the war, the siege of Mariupol, and particularly the Azovstal steel plant, using theoretical work I had been doing on what I call symbolic density. But then I was again encouraged, as I had been by Donna Marie and Stefano, to bring my experience with war into my presentation. So here I am again, the dream of March 16th notwithstanding, going into some very dark places. One of the problems is that very few people really think deeply about war, in my experience. For those who have been in combat, as well as those non-combatants directly affected by war, such as Anna and her colleagues in Ukraine, the experience is so particular to them that the idea of war is reduced, as an old military expression has it, to periods of boredom punctuated by moments of extreme terror. For the combatant or the non-combatant under attack, war is in their body. As Wilfred Bion recounts in his compelling remembrance of his experience as a tank commander in World War I. Under these conditions, the larger frame within which those events occur becomes an abstraction. On the other hand, for the so-called defense intellectuals and all too many politicians who have never been in the military, let alone in combat, the abstraction of the political and military process occludes the suffering on the ground. There, you will hear expressions such as the use of the military instrument, as if the soldiers on the ground were mere automatons. Meanwhile, the outside observer has difficulty making sense of their point of view. Let me outline my own experience, which will shape my comments. I first want to be clear that I have never been in combat. And while I know many men who have been in combat, I am reluctant to try to speak about the visceral experience of combat. I have, however, spent several years in the academic world of defense intellectuals, so I come to that discussion from a middle space between the bodily experiences of combat and the abstraction of the intellectuals. I spent 4 years, from 1971 to 1975, on active duty in the Air Force. The first 2 of those years with tactical combat units, first in Texas and then in Korea. In 1973, for reasons too complicated to explain here, I was transferred to the Plans and Policy Office in the headquarters of the 5th Air Force in Japan. I was 25 years old, and the position I assumed as the plans officer was normally assigned to a far more senior officer. 5th Air Force was responsible for all Air Force operations in Northeast Asia, particularly for the defense of Korea, South Korea, and Taiwan. The planning process for war is complex and paradoxical. General Eisenhower captured the paradox in a famous remark: plans are worthless, but planning is indispensable. Planning involves all the elements of the military and many from outside the military. It is, for example, an absolute necessity that planning address the logistics of the supply of the force. Armies, at least as far back as Alexander the Great, have worried at least as much about their supply lines as about combat that might last for a day or 2. My role in the planning process was to understand the overarching conceptualization of what the plans were intended to accomplish, called the concept of operations, in conjunction with the operational doctrines of the services and the consequent interaction of the services with one another, the command relations. If the term doctrine has a somewhat theological tone to it, it is because working with military doctrine, in other words, the fundamental principles which each service applies to its role on the battlefield, benefits greatly from theological training. It is only quite recently that Congress has insisted that the services coordinate their doctrines in advance, and at the time I was involved in planning, Coordinating the warfighting process resembled something akin to the Council of Nicaea. As Clausewitz remarked, war is a continuation of policy by other means. Due to political decisions in the United States at the end of the Vietnam War, our plan was based on the need to defeat the North Korean army within 90 days if it invaded the South. To accomplish this objective, the doctrine of the US Army required levels of artillery fire that would destroy their artillery in short order. Many people don't realize that the barrels of cannons wear out quite rapidly when being fired at the rates you now see in Ukraine and need to be replaced regularly. This required that the Army, this means that the Army required both monumental levels of resupply and the use of Air Force resources in unprecedented ways, contrary to Air Force doctrine. For the 2 years I was at the 5th Air Force, my primary responsibility was working through the implications of these competing requirements with the other services and the command structure necessary to control the entire process. All of this was based on being very clear that the level of force required to destroy the North Korean army was immense. In 1975, I left active duty and returned to Yale, where I had spent 1 year in graduate school before going on active duty. I continued, however, as a reserve officer assigned to the Pentagon, where I worked on policy in East Asia and on strategic issues, including nuclear war and deterrence. After completing my PhD in philosophy, which is when I began my work on Jung, I joined the Yale School of Management faculty. I taught courses on politics, and I chaired the faculty study seminar on international security and arms control. In 1986, I moved to the MacArthur Foundation as the assistant director of the program on peace and international security. This was the period when the policies of the Reagan administration involved the deployment of Pershing missiles in Europe and provoked a response in the arms control movement that drew a large segment of the more traditional defense community into those processes. The MacArthur Foundation was deeply involved in this. In 1989, at midlife, I no longer felt the international security world was the place to spend the rest of my life, and I turned to clinical work, which I've been engaged in ever since. Still in all, I spent 20 years working on various aspects of war, international security, and arms control. It is nevertheless this background that determines my point of view when asked about the situation in Ukraine. I do not look at it first as a Jungian analyst, but as a war planner. In terms of the execution of war, I, like any other military planner, began as an absolutist. Once the decision is made to go to war, the military objective is the total defeat of the enemy force. Obviously, in line with Clausewitz's maxim, that objective is immediately constrained by the decisions of the policymakers. In Korea, we assumed that the North would throw its massive army across the border to capture Seoul. Firepower had to be sufficient to stop that advance within a few kilometers of the demilitarized zone. We thought we needed to do that in 90 days because the Congress had just passed the War Powers Act, which required the president to bring any conflict before Congress within 90 days for a declaration of war. At the end of the Vietnam War, we were not sure Congress would support another war in Asia, and so we had to plan to get the job done as fast as possible. Ironically, the War Powers Act has never been invoked. This political side of war, rather than the actual military execution of the war, has been at the center of discussion regarding Ukraine, at least in the United States. Unfortunately, we are in the middle of yet another presidential campaign cycle in the US, and the political environment is fraught. I wish I could say something positive about where the US stands. As I believe we are all aware, President Biden and the European leaders, given the possibility of a much larger war with Russia, made an understandable but perhaps short-sighted decision at the beginning of the war to provide Ukraine with material support in increments that never allowed for decisive action on the part of the Ukrainian military. This is not the whole story, however. What is probably less well understood outside the military is that the primary weapon systems of the United States and most of the European countries are now not only technically complex, which the Ukrainians could easily master, but also depend on highly integrated command and weapons interaction on the battlefield. This is part of the development of doctrine and requires years of training and preparation at all levels of the military hierarchy. Just recently, for example, 2 Abrams tanks were apparently either immobilized or destroyed, most likely due to being in action without support, either from ground forces or air coverage. This is where the planning process and the training that goes with it are essential to success in war. The Russian army, on the other hand, poorly commanded and never well trained, with top leadership that has little or no concern for their forces, is following their classic doctrine, such as it is, of throwing mass formations, sometimes with barely functional weapons, into the battle, thereby exhausting the resources of their opponents, while often actively encouraging pillage and rape as policies. As an aside, I once had a conversation with a former German officer who was wounded and evacuated from the Battle of Stalingrad shortly before the collapse of the German army. I asked him what he had experienced, and he replied, "They just kept coming, no matter what we did." On a larger scale, I'm afraid that the situation in Ukraine, given what is happening elsewhere, makes it possible that the whole fabric of the post-World War II international order may begin to unravel. I hope that enough political will in the US can be generated to continue active and decisive support for Ukraine. While there are some indications that enough members of the Republican Party still support Ukraine to carry the day, but it will be a close call. President Biden, in his recent State of the Union address, put Ukraine at the front of his speech and was unwavering in his support for Ukraine. However, if the politics of the current presidential campaign undermines American military support for Ukraine, it will fall to the Europeans to determine to what extent they can maintain Ukraine's resistance. It appears that France is already taking steps to prepare for such an eventuality. Is there a place for Jung or analytical psychology in this dark space? At least part of my reluctance to get into my background is because I'm sure it appears to be anything but Jungian. Let me nevertheless try to find a way into that side of the experience. The advertised title of this presentation is Presence, Manifestation, and Proclamation. The title I originally proposed, in line with my original intention to discuss symbolism, was Reflections on Images from Hell, the siege of Mariupol and the defense of the Azovstal steel plant. Let me see if I can tie these together and give us some sense of how, as Jungians, we can see our role in this conflict. In Anne Ulalov's marvelous presentation that initiated this project and continues in many ways to sustain it, she turned to Jung's Red Book to draw us into the complex experience of the initial stages of what has now become a long and exhausting conflict. I want to turn to the Red Book as well to set in motion some reflections on that singular event relatively early in the war, the siege of the Azovstal plant, and offer some thoughts on how so terrible an event may bring some light to the situation the world finds itself in. And I say the world because, as I've already alluded to, I do believe that the outcome of this war will be consequential far beyond the borders of Ukraine and far beyond the time we live in. I will begin with a passage from chapter 5 of Liber Primus, Descent into Hell in the Future. Jung writes, "But who can withstand fear when the divine intoxication and madness comes to him? Love, soul, and God are beautiful and terrible. The ancients brought over some of the beauty of God into this world, and this world became so beautiful that it appears to the spirit of the time to be fulfillment and better than the bosom of the Godhead. The frightfulness and cruelty of the world lay under wraps and in the depths of our hearts. If the spirit of the depths seizes you, you will feel the cruelty and cry out in torment. The spirits of the depths is pregnant with iron, fire, and death. You are right to fear the spirit of the depths. He is full of horror." Jung was writing at the beginning of the First World War, which was another singular turning point in history. As Barbara Tuchman shows in her masterful account of the start of the war, an entire world was ending, and a new one was being born. In terms of war, World War I was the logical outgrowth of a process that began with Napoleon and, most critically, the American Civil War, the industrialization of war. When Jung wrote these words, war was yet to achieve its apotheosis, its self-divinization, but that came in due course with World War II and the creation of the atomic bomb. Much of the news coverage of the war in Ukraine has highlighted the role of new technologies in war. These precision munitions need only be fired and then find the target on their own. And of course, there are the ubiquitous drones that come with their own cameras that let us sit in the comfort of our homes and watch as tanks and often individual soldiers are hunted down and destroyed. However, Jung's passage alerts us to another aspect of this war we should consider. Beginning in the Vietnam War, at least in the United States, participation in war became increasingly optional. Civilian life would go on as usual, with only the poor and a few committed to military service engaging in the conflict. One could have one's war while the world remained so beautiful that it appeared to the spirit of the times to be fulfillment and better than the bosom of the Godhead. For Jung, or for the spirit of the depths, this is terribly out of balance. Just before the passage above, Jung remarked, "The spirit of this time is ungodly. The spirit of the depths is ungodly. Balance is godly." Where then are we to look for balance? In my email to my colleague, Donna Marie Flanagan, all the way back at the start of the war, I remarked, "I think you can view the war as a genuinely numinous event, mysterium tremendum et fascinans." The reference here is to Rudolf Otto's definition of the holy or the sacred. It is a theme taken up by Paul Ricoeur in an essay entitled Manifestation and Proclamation, from which the title of this presentation derives. The distinction Ricoeur draws in his essay is most easily summarized as a distinction between talking about the sacred by way, for example, of the parables of Jesus, which Ricoeur calls proclamation, and allowing the sacred to make itself present through manifestation. In philosophical terms, this is a distinction between a hermeneutics or interpretation of the text and a phenomenology or experience of that which is made present. Following Mircea Eliade, Ricoeur argues that the manifestations of the sacred concern the central notion of a hierophany. Ricoeur writes, "Although we cannot directly describe the numinous element as such, we can at least describe how it manifests itself. So anything by which the sacred shows itself is a hierophany, and at the same time, A phenomenology of the sacred is possible because these manifestations have a form, a structure, an articulation. However, and to me this is essential, this articulation is not originally a verbal one, even though the expression to manifest or to show may suggest this. Here, no privilege is conferred on speech. Ricoeur identified several other characteristics of manifestation. They exist in some sense outside time and space, express themselves through myth and ritual, and connect with a primordial way to the movements of nature and the elemental dimensions of the world, air, fire, water, and earth. Now, at this point, I have to share my screen. If I can get this to work. So, returning to my original title for my presentation, I want to turn to the siege of Mariupol and the Azovstal steel plant, February 24th to 20th May 2022. This was the first great battle of the war, and in many respects stands as the iconic moment in the war. To understand Mariupol, I strongly recommend watching the remarkable documentary on the siege that recently won an Academy Award. You should find it harrowing to watch, but it is an important document that will, as the filmmaker said in his acceptance speech, help define the history of this moment. Mariupol has the unfortunate fate of being on the coast between Russia itself and Russian-occupied Crimea. It was a perfect target for initial Russian operations. The Azovstal steel plant, built in the early 1930s under Stalin and in almost continuous use until the Russian invasion, when the manager ordered the blast furnaces turned off for the first time since 1949, is a remarkable image of the spirit of the time and the massive industrial foundations of modern warfare. The plant was, because it effectively no longer exists, enormous, designed to be a small city to itself. Living quarters were built for the site workers and their families. With the coming of the Cold War, bomb shelters were constructed deep beneath the plant and stocked to maintain the workers and their families. In the event of the war, in the event of war, these shelters would play a vital but complex role in the siege, when as many as 2,500 soldiers from the Azovstal regiment significantly expanded the population of the plant, where shelter and resources had been stored only sufficient to support the workers and their families. A massive steel plant under siege is, I would suggest, transformed into the very epitome of the spirits of the depths, pregnant with iron, fire, and death. At the time of the siege, these remarkable photographs emerged from inside the steel plant, capturing the dualities that can sometimes characterize the most brutal conflicts. Some of these reflect the soldiers' lives in these confined and dark places, but include the young woman and soldier leading men in patriotic songs. You can find a video of one of these on YouTube. I will provide the link to the organizers for inclusion in the presentation. Others reflect the spirit of resilience that allowed them to hold up for 20 days. Finally, there is the iconic picture of a soldier standing in a space that must have been, in fact, a simulacrum of hell itself. Illuminated from beyond the confines of the plant, his arms outstretched prayer-like in what must be an expression of both joy and despair. A few feet from the soldier, on a remnant of some industrial machinery, one can imagine an altar set with the implements of the sacraments. It is a remarkable, one might say, an archetypal image that truly captures the sense of the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, a hierophany or manifestation of the sacred. We are now 2 years beyond the events in Mariupol and the Azovstal steel plant, and the war has taken on many new characteristics. The Ukrainian army made a concerted effort to break through the Russian offensive in the last few months, but it appears to have been stalled. We may have reached a point, as in other wars, where stalemate and grinding trench warfare take over from maneuver, which is critical to success in a conflict such as this. We don't know what the full impact of the new technologies will be on the war, but they will most certainly change how war is conducted in the future. These outcomes will ultimately have their expression in the realm of language, and as Ricoeur argues, they will be subject to the hermeneutics of language, of proclamation. They will be interpreted, often to the advantage of the interpreter. This will be the realm of commentary and academic study for years. While I would not discourage encouraging with that political and perhaps academic discourse, it will remain for the events of the Azovstal steel plant and throughout Mariupol, and I am quite sure in many other places in Ukraine, to manifest some sense of the numinous, at least briefly, some epiphany of the sacred itself. It seems to me that this is the place that will require careful attention, and it will present a space where Jungians can contribute in ways that other mental health providers may not be as well prepared, well equipped to deal with the realities of the situation. It is a suggestion, and I will leave it there for now. Returning to my resistance to engage in this discussion, I learned in my time in the world of war planning that there is no room for prevarication. There is no safe place where you can equivocate about the reality of the undertaking. Consciousness, if that is what one aspires to, must be fully aware and clear that the objective is destroying the enemy. Political considerations may alter that objective, but the military planner is set on it from the start, which entails its own distinctive form of moral and psychological risk. It is a shadowy, dark place where your objective is, following General Sherman, to create hell. I've learned to be very careful about how and when I let myself slip back into that world. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, George. And thank you, Anja, for your very impressive presentations. It will not be easy, maybe not possible, to bring this to presentations under one roof. And I only can encourage you, listeners, to bring these questions home to your friends and colleagues to talk about what we have heard today. That, for example, war is in their body, or the outside observer has no idea, can't imagine what is really going on. I was reminded of my parents. My father survived shortly before Stalingrad, and he was brought home, deeply wounded. My mother suffered during the bombing raid on Würzburg in 1945, and she was frozen all her life. Yeah, she couldn't overcome this trauma. I was deeply impressed by this photo from Mariupol, the light, yeah, the hope, symbolized by the light. And of course, we all wonder what happened with this man or with this young soldier on this other photo. Okay, I just want to finish what I said at the beginning. Maybe it is time for a kind of an ethical cash audit, moralischer Kassensturz, about the ethical and moral values of Europe and of some principal values of Jungian psychology. I think George was speaking about this, yeah, the integration of shadow in this kind of situation when the hell is open. And I want to finish with passing on now to our colleague, Cheryl Towers, who will say something about the possibilities to support this Ukraine project. And thank you again for your presentations, and Anna for her openness to speak about her traumas in this wonderful way. So thank you. Cheryl, it's yours now.
Thank you. Well, I would just like to say that this webinar, it's offered a study of the reality of war, and it has taken us through the dark places. It has been a search for words to adequately express the nature of such times. And they had also included moments where light strangely shines even in the deepest darkness. Thank you to George and Anna for their courageous contributions, and also thank you, Jörg, for yours. It takes courage to bear witness to war, and even greater courage to keep on enduring the effects of war on the soul. We've now entered the third year of this brutal war, and our Ukrainian friends are weary. This is why it is more important than ever to be unwavering in our support of them, to let them know that they are not on their own, to let them know that we hold them in our hearts and minds. And a vital aspect of such holding, of course, is to continue with your generous contributions and donations that can offer some financial assistance to our colleagues at such a precarious time for them. So the link enabling you to do this is displayed on your screens at the moment and is also available on the ARAS website. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you. And I'll pass back to Joe.
Well, first, very moving. I wanted to thank George and Anna and Jörg. Anna, who again stayed in Kharkiv until October of 2023 before relocating to the UK. She was a direct witness to what she presented. And Jörg for this powerful, evocative webinar as well, his handling of it. Please write any questions or comments you may have in an email to, again, wuj@citypsychotherapy.org, and we will make sure that they are passed on to the speakers. During the course of this webinar, I got news from the New York Times, an alert that there is at least a stopgap measure that the US Senate has now passed without needing to go to the House of Representatives, $300 million. It's not nearly enough, but it does help, and hopefully the fight within the U.S. government can continue and to bring the full support. The next webinar, number 15, the wisdom of the arts in healing trauma, will be held on April 16th. The speakers will be Ursula Wirtz, a Jungian analyst in Zurich, who is an expert on trauma and who's been working with our Ukrainian colleagues even prior to the invasion, together with Victoria Demchenko from Ukraine and chaired by Eva Pattis from Milan. This will be another powerful set of presentations well worth attending. Following that, in May, we are planning something of a different nature for the webinar, but that's still in the planning phases. So to bring this to a close, we will now listen to the prayer for Ukraine by the composer Mykola Lysenko and wish all Ukrainian colleagues to remain safe. Thank you all for your time and attention.
Боже великий єдиний, нам Україну храни. Волі світу промінням ти її осіни. Світлом науки і знання нас дітей просвіти. Чисті любові до краю, ти нас, Боже, зрости. Молимось, Боже єдиний, нам Україну